The Last Test by Adolphe Danziger and H.P. Lovecraft. Part 1. Few persons know the inside of the Clarendon story, or even that there is an inside not reached by the newspapers. It was a San Francisco sensation in the days before the fire, both because of the panic and menace that kept it company, and because of its close linkage with the governor of the state. Governor Dalton, it will be recalled, was Clarendon's best friend, and later married his sister. Neither Dalton nor Mrs. Dalton would ever discuss the painful affair, but somehow the facts have leaked out to a limited circle. But for that, and for the years which have given a sort of vagueness and impersonality to the actors, one would still pause before probing into secrets so strictly guarded at the time. The appointment of Dr. Alfred Clarendon as medical director of San Quentin Penitentiary in 1890 was greeted with the keenest enthusiasm throughout California. San Francisco had at last the honor of harboring one of the greatest biologists and physicians of the period, and solid pathological leaders from all over the world might be expected to flock thither to study his methods, profit by his advice and researches, and learn how to cope with their own local problems. California, almost overnight, would become a center of medical scholarship, with earthwide influence and reputation. Governor Dalton, anxious to spread the news in its fullest significance, saw to it that the press carried ample and dignified accounts of his new appointee. Pictures of Dr. Clarendon and his new home near Old Goat Hill, sketches of his career and manifold honors, and popular accounts of his salient scientific discoveries were all presented in the principal California dailies, till the public soon felt a sort of reflected pride in the man whose studies of pyemia in 1851 India, of the pest in China, and of every sort of kindred disorder elsewhere, would soon enrich the world of medicine with an antitoxin of revolutionary importance, a basic antitoxin combating the whole febrile principle at its very source, and ensuring the ultimate conquest and extirpation of fever in all its diverse forms. Back of the appointment stretched an extended and not wholly unromantic history of early friendship, long separation, and dramatically renewed acquaintance. James Dalton and the Clarendon family had been friends in New York 10 years before. Friends and more than friends, since the doctor's only sister, Georgina, was the sweetheart of Dalton's youth, while the doctor himself had been his closest associate and almost his protégé in the days of school and college. The father of Alfred and Georgina, a Wall Street pirate of the ruthless elder breed, had known Dalton's father well. So well indeed that he had finally stripped him of all he possessed in a memorable afternoon's fight on the stock exchange. Dalton Sr., hopeless of recuperation and wishing to give his one adored child the benefit of his insurance, had promptly blown out his brains. But James had not sought to retaliate. It was, as he viewed it, all in the game, and he wished no harm to the father of the girl he meant to marry, and of the budding young scientist whose admirer and protector he had been throughout their years of fellowship and study. Instead, he turned to the law, established himself in a small way, and in due course of time asked Old Clarendon for Georgina's hand. Old Clarendon had refused very firmly and loudly, vowing that no pauper and upstart lawyer was fit to be his son-in-law, and a scene of considerable violence had occurred. James, telling the wrinkled freebooter at last what he ought to have been told long before, had left the house and the city in a high temper, and was embarked within a month upon the California life which was to lead him to the governorship through many a fight with ring and politician. His farewells to Alfred and Georgina had been brief, and he had never known the aftermath of that scene in the Clarendon library. Only by a day did he miss the news of old Clarendon's death from apoplexy, and by so missing it, changed the course of his whole career. He had not written Georgina in the decade that followed, knowing her loyalty to her father, and waiting till his own fortune and position might remove all obstacles to the match. Nor had he sent any word to Alfred, whose calm indifference in the face of affection and hero worship had always savored of conscious destiny and the self-sufficiency of genius. Secure in the ties of a constancy rare even then, he had worked and risen with thoughts only of the future, still a bachelor and with a perfect intuitive faith that Georgina also was waiting. In this faith, Dalton was not deceived. Wondering perhaps why no message ever came, Georgina found no romance save in her dreams and expectations, and in the course of time became busy with the new responsibilities brought by her brother's rise to greatness. Alfred's growth had not belied the promise of his youth, and the slim boy had darted quietly up the steps of science with a speed and permanence almost dizzying to contemplate. Lean and ascetic, with steel-rimmed pince-nez and pointed brown beard, Dr. Alfred Clarendon was an authority at 25 and an international figure at 30. Careless of worldly affairs with the negligence of genius, he depended vastly on the care and management of his sister, and was secretly thankful that her memories of James had kept her from other and more tangible alliances. Georgina conducted the business and household of the great bacteriologist, and was proud of his strides toward the conquest of fever. She bore patiently with his eccentricities, calmed his occasional bursts of fanaticism, and healed those breaches with his friends, which now and then resulted from his unconcealed scorn of anything less than a single-minded devotion to pure truth and its progress. Clarendon was undeniably irritating at times to ordinary folk, for he never tired of depreciating the service of the individual as contrasted with the service of mankind as a whole, and in censuring men of learning who mingled domestic life or outside interests with their pursuit of abstract science. His enemies called him a bore, but his admirers, pausing before the white heat of ecstasy into which he would work himself, became almost ashamed of ever having had any standards or aspirations outside the one divine sphere of unalloyed knowledge. The doctor's travels were extensive, and Georgina generally accompanied him on the shorter ones. 3 times, however, he had taken long, lone jaunts to strange and distant places in his studies of exotic fevers and half-fabulous plagues, for he knew that it is out of the unknown lands of cryptic and immemorial Asia that most of the earth's diseases spring. On each of these occasions, he had brought back curious mementos, which added to the eccentricity of his home, not least among which was the needlessly large staff of 8 Tibetan servants, picked up somewhere in Utsang during an epidemic of which the world never heard, but amidst which Clarendon had discovered and isolated the germ of black fever. These men, taller than most Tibetans, and clearly belonging to a stock, but little investigated in the outside world, were of a skeletonic leanness, which made one wonder whether the doctor had sought to symbolize in them the anatomical models of his college years. Their aspect, in the loose black silk robes of Bupa priests which he chose to give them, was grotesque in the highest degree, and there was an unsmiling silence and stiffness in their motions, which enhanced their air of fantasy, and gave Georgina a queer, awed feeling of having stumbled into the pages of Vathek or the Arabian Nights. But queerest of all was the general factotum or clinic man, whom Clarendon addressed as Sarama, and whom he had brought back with him after a long stay in northern Africa, during which he had studied certain odd intermittent fevers among the mysterious Saharan Tuaregs, whose descent from the primal race of lost Atlantis is an old archaeological rumor. Sarama, a man of great intelligence and seemingly inexhaustible erudition, was as morbidly lean as the Tibetan servants, with swarthy, parchment-like skin drawn so tightly over his bald pate and hairless face that every line of the skull stood out in ghastly prominence, this death's head effect being heightened by lusterlessly burning black eyes, set with a depth which left to common visibility only a pair of dark, vacant sockets. Unlike the ideal subordinate, he seemed, despite his impassive features, to spend an effort in concealing such emotions as he possessed. Instead, he carried about an insidious atmosphere of irony or amusement, accompanied at certain moments by a deep, guttural chuckle, like that of a giant turtle which has just torn to pieces some furry animal and is ambling away toward the sea. His race appeared to be Caucasian, but could not be classified more closely than that. Some of Clarendon's friends thought he looked like a high-caste Hindu, notwithstanding his accentless speech, while many agreed with Georgina, who disliked him, when she gave her opinion that a pharaoh's mummy, if miraculously brought to life, would form a very apt twin for this sardonic skeleton. Dalton, absorbed in his uphill political battles and isolated from Eastern interests through the peculiar self-sufficiency of the Old West, had not followed the meteoric rise of his former comrade. Clarendon had actually heard nothing of one so far outside his chosen world of science as the governor. Being of independent and even of abundant means, the Clarendons had for many years stuck to their old Manhattan mansion in East 19th Street, whose ghosts must have looked sorely askance at the bizarrerie of Sarama and the Tibetans. Then, through the doctor's wish to transfer his base of medical observation, the great change had suddenly come. and they had crossed the continent to take up a secluded life in San Francisco, buying the gloomy old Bannister place near Goat Hill, overlooking the bay, and establishing their strange household in a rambling, French-roofed relic of mid-Victorian design and Gold Rush parvenu display, set amidst high-walled grounds in a region still half suburban. Dr. Clarendon, though better satisfied than in New York, still felt cramped for lack of opportunities to apply and test his pathological theories. Unworldly as he was, he had never thought of using his reputation as an influence to gain public appointment. Though more and more he realized that only the medical directorship of a government or a charitable institution, a prison, almshouse, or hospital, would give him a field of sufficient width to complete his researches and make his discoveries of the greatest use to humanity and science at large. Then he had run into James Dalton by sheer accident one afternoon in Market Street, as the governor was swinging out of the Royal Hotel. Georgina had been with him, and an almost instant recognition had heightened the drama of the reunion. Mutual ignorance of one another's progress had bred long explanations and histories, and Clarendon was pleased to find that he had so important an official for a friend. Dalton and Georgina, exchanging many a glance, felt more than a trace of their youthful tenderness, and a friendship was then and there revived, which led to frequent calls and a fuller and fuller exchange of confidences. James Dalton learned of his old protégé's need for political appointment, and sought, true to his protective role of school and college days, to devise some means of giving little Alf the needed position and scope. He had, it is true, wide appointive powers, but the legislature's constant attacks and encroachments forced him to exercise these with the utmost discretion. At length, however, scarcely 3 months after the sudden reunion, the foremost institutional medical office in the state fell vacant. Weighing all the elements with care, and conscious that his friend's achievements and reputation would justify the most substantial rewards, the governor felt at last able to act. Formalities were few, and on the 8th of November, 1890, Dr. Alfred Schuyler Clarendon became medical director of the California State Penitentiary at San Quentin. Part 2. In scarcely more than a month, the hopes of Dr. Clarendon's admirers were amply fulfilled. Sweeping changes in methods brought to the prison's medical routine an efficiency never before dreamed of. And though the subordinates were naturally not without jealousy, they were obliged to admit the magical results of a really great man's superintendence. Then came a time when mere appreciation might well have grown to devout thankfulness at a providential conjunction of time, place, and man. For one morning, Dr. Jones came to his new chief with a grave face to announce his discovery of a case which he could not but identify as that self-same black fever whose germ Clarendon had found and classified. Dr. Clarendon showed no surprise, but kept on at the writing before him. "I know," he said evenly. "I came across that case yesterday. I'm glad you recognized it. Put the man in a separate ward, though I don't believe this fever is contagious." Dr. Jones, with his own opinion of the malady's contagiousness, was glad of this deference to caution, and hastened to execute the order. Upon his return, Clarendon rose to leave, declaring that he would himself take charge of the case alone. Disappointed in his wish to study the great man's methods and technique, the junior physician watched his chief stride away toward the lone ward where he had placed the patient, more critical of the new regime than at any time since admiration had displaced his first jealous pangs. Reaching the ward, Clarendon entered hastily, glancing at the bed and stepping back to see how far Dr. Jones's obvious curiosity might have led him. Then, finding the corridor still vacant, he shut the door and turned to examine the sufferer. The man was a convict of a peculiarly repulsive type, and seemed to be racked by the keenest throes of agony. His features were frightfully contracted, and his knees drawn sharply up in the mute desperation of the stricken. Clarendon studied him closely, raising his tightly shut eyelids, took his pulse and temperature, and finally dissolving a tablet in water, forced the solution between the sufferer's lips. Before long, the height of the attack abated, as shown by the relaxing body and returning normality of expression, and the patient began to breathe more easily. Then, by a soft rubbing of the ears, the doctor caused the man to open his eyes. There was life in them, for they moved from side to side, though they lacked the fine fire which we are wont to deem the image of the soul. Clarendon smiled as he surveyed the peace his help had brought, feeling behind him the power of an all-capable science. He had long known of this case, and had snatched the victim from death with the work of a moment. Another hour, and this man would have gone, yet Jones had seen the symptoms for days before discovering them, and having discovered them, did not know what to do. Man's conquest of disease, however, cannot be perfect. Clarendon, assuring the dubious trusty nurses that the fever was not contagious, had had the patient bathed, sponged in alcohol, and put to bed, but was told the next morning that the case was lost. The man had died after midnight, in the most intense agony, and with such cries and distortions of face that the nurses were driven almost to panic. The doctor took this news with his usual calm, whatever his scientific feelings may have been, and ordered the burial of the patient in quicklime. Then, with a philosophic shrug of the shoulders, he made the usual rounds of the penitentiary. 2 days later, the prison was hit again. 3 men came down at once this time, and there was no concealing the fact that a black fever epidemic was underway. Clarendon, having adhered so firmly to his theory of non-contagiousness, suffered a distinct loss of prestige, and was handicapped by the refusal of the trusty nurses to attend the patients. Theirs was not the sole free devotion of those who sacrifice themselves to science and humanity. They were convicts, serving only because of the privileges they could not otherwise buy, and when the price became too great, they preferred to resign the privileges. But the doctor was still master of the situation. Consulting with the warden and sending urgent messages to his friend the governor, he saw to it that special rewards in cash and in reduced terms were offered to the convicts for the dangerous nursing service, and by this method succeeded in getting a very fair quota of volunteers. He was steeled for action now, and nothing could shake his poise and determination. Additional cases brought only a curt nod, and he seemed a stranger to fatigue as he hastened from bedside to bedside all over the vast stone home of sadness and evil. More than 40 cases developed within another week, and nurses had to be brought from the city. Clarendon went home very seldom at this stage, often sleeping on a cot in the warden's quarters, and always giving himself up with typical abandon to the service of medicine and of mankind. Then came the first mutterings of that storm which was soon to convulse San Francisco. News will out, and the menace of black fever spread over the town like a fog from the bay. Reporters trained in the doctrine of sensation first used their imagination without restraint, and gloried when at last they were able to produce a case in the Mexican Quarter, which a local physician, fonder perhaps of money than of truth or civic welfare, pronounced black fever. That was the last straw. Frantic at the thought of the crawling death so close upon them, the people of San Francisco went mad en masse and embarked upon that historic exodus of which all the country was soon to hear over busy wires. Ferries and rowboats, excursion steamers and launches, railways and cable cars, bicycles and carriages, moving vans and work carts, all were pressed into instant and frenzied service. Sausalito and Tamalpais, as lying in the direction of San Quentin, shared in the flight, while housing space in Oakland, Berkeley, and Alameda rose to fabulous prices. Tent colonies sprang up, and improvised villages lined the crowded southward highways from Millbrae to San Jose. Many sought refuge with friends in Sacramento, while the fright-shaken residue forced by various causes to stay behind could do little more than maintain the basic necessities of a nearly dead city. Business, save for quack doctors with sure cures and preventives for use against the fever, fell rapidly to the vanishing point. At first, the saloons offered medicated drinks, but soon found that the populace preferred to be duped by charlatans of more professional aspect. In strangely noiseless streets, persons peered into one another's faces to glimpse possible plague symptoms, and shopkeepers began more and more to refuse admission to their clientele, each customer seeming to them a fresh fever menace. Legal and judicial machinery began to disintegrate as attorneys and county clerks succumbed one by one to the urge for flight. Even the doctors deserted in large numbers, many of them pleading the need of vacations among the mountains and the lakes in the northern part of the state. Schools and colleges, theaters and cafes, restaurants and saloons, all gradually closed their doors. And in a single week, San Francisco lay prostrate and inert, with only its light, power, and water service even half normal, with newspapers in skeletonic form, and with a crippled parody on transportation maintained by the horse and cable cars. This was the lowest ebb. It could not last long, for courage and observation are not altogether dead in mankind, and sooner or later, the non-existence of any widespread black fever epidemic outside San Quentin became too obvious a fact to deny, notwithstanding several actual cases and the undeniable spread of typhoid in the insanitary suburban tent colonies. The leaders and editors of the community conferred and took action, enlisting in their service the very reporters whose energies had done so much to bring on the trouble, but now turning their sensation-first avidity into more constructive channels. Editorials and fictitious interviews appeared, telling of Dr. Clarendon's complete control of the disease and of the absolute impossibility of its diffusion beyond the prison walls. Reiteration and circulation slowly did their work, and gradually a slim backward trickle of urbanites swelled into a vigorous refluent stream. One of the first healthy symptoms was the start of a newspaper controversy, of the approved acrimonious kind, attempting to fix blame for the panic wherever the various participants thought it belonged. The returning doctors, jealously strengthened by their timely vacations, began striking at Clarendon, assuring the public that they, as well as he, would keep the fever in leash, and censuring him for not doing even more to check its spread within San Quentin. Clarendon had, they averred, permitted far more deaths than were necessary. The various tyro in medicine knew how to check fever contagion, and if this renowned savant did not do it, it was clearly because he chose for scientific reasons to study the final effects of the disease, rather than to prescribe properly and save the victims. This policy, they insinuated, might be proper enough among convicted murderers in a penal institution, but it would not do in San Francisco, where life was still a precious and sacred thing. Thus they went on, and the papers were glad to publish all they wrote, since the sharpness of the campaign, in which Dr. Clarendon would doubtless join, would help to obliterate confusion and restore confidence among the people. But Clarendon did not reply. He only smiled, while his singular clinic man Sarama indulged in many a deep, testudinous chuckle. He was at home more nowadays, so that reporters began besieging the gate of the great wall the doctor had built around his house, instead of pestering the warden's office at San Quentin. Results, though, were equally meager, for Sarama formed an impassable barrier between the doctor and the outer world, even after the reporters had got into the grounds. The newspaper men getting access to the front hall had glimpses of Clarendon's singular entourage, and made the best they could in a write-up of Sarama and the queer, skeletonic Tibetans. Exaggeration, of course, occurred in every fresh article, and the net effect of the publicity was distinctly adverse to the great physician. Most persons hate the unusual, and hundreds who could have excused heartlessness or incompetence stood ready to condemn the grotesque taste manifested in the chuckling attendant and the 8 black-robed Orientals. Early in January, an especially persistent young man from the Observer climbed the moated 8-foot brick wall in the rear of the Clarendon grounds and began a survey of the varied outdoor appearances which trees concealed from the front walk. With quick, alert brain he took in everything: the rose arbor, the aviaries, the animal cages where all sorts of mammalia from monkeys to guinea pigs might be seen and heard, the stout wooden clinic building with barred windows in the northwest corner of the yard, and bent searching glances throughout the 1,000 square feet of intramural privacy. A great article was brewing, and he would have escaped unscathed but for the barking of Dick, Georgina Clarendon's gigantic and beloved Saint Bernard. Sarama, instant in his response, had the youth by the collar before a protest could be uttered, and was presently shaking him, as a terrier shakes a rat, and dragging him through the trees to the front yard and the gate. Breathless explanations and quavering demands to see Dr. Clarendon were useless. Sarama only chuckled and dragged his victim on. Suddenly, a positive fright crept over the dapper scribe, and he began to wish desperately that this unearthly creature would speak, if only to prove that he really was a being of honest flesh and blood belonging to this planet. He became deathly sick, and strove not to glimpse the eyes which he knew must lie at the base of those gaping black sockets. Soon he heard the gate open, and felt himself propelled violently through. In another moment, waking rudely to the things of earth as he landed wetly and muddily in the ditch, which Clarendon had had dug around the entire length of the wall. Fright gave place to rage as he heard the massive gate slam shut, and he rose dripping to shake his fist at the forbidding portal. Then, as he turned to go, a soft sound grated behind him, and through a small wicket in the gate, he felt the sunken eyes of Sarama and heard the echoes of a deep-voiced, blood-freezing chuckle. This young man, feeling perhaps justly that his handling had been rougher than he deserved, resolved to revenge himself upon the household responsible for his treatment. Accordingly, he prepared a fictitious interview with Dr. Clarendon, supposed to be held in the clinic building, during which he was careful to describe the agonies of a dozen black fever patients whom his imagination ranged on orderly rows of couches. His masterstroke was the picture of one especially pathetic sufferer gasping for water, while the doctor held a glass of the sparkling fluid just out of his reach, in a scientific attempt to determine the effect of a tantalizing emotion on the course of the disease. This invention was followed by paragraphs of insinuating comment so outwardly respectful that it bore a double venom. Dr. Clarendon was, the article ran, undoubtedly the greatest and most single-minded scientist in the world. But science is no friend to individual welfare, and one would not like to have one's gravest ills drawn out and aggravated merely to satisfy an investigator on some point of abstract truth. Life is too short for that. Altogether, the article was diabolically skillful, and succeeded in horrifying 9 readers out of 10 against Dr. Clarendon and his supposed methods. Other papers were quick to copy and enlarge upon its substance, taking the cue it offered, and commencing a series of faked interviews which fairly ran the gamut of derogatory fantasy. In no case, however, did the doctor condescend to offer a contradiction. He had no time to waste on fools and liars, and cared little for the esteem of a thoughtless rabble he despised. When James Dalton telegraphed his regrets and offered aid, Clarendon replied with an almost boorish curtness. He did not heed the barking of dogs, and could not bother to muzzle them. Nor would he thank anyone for messing with a matter wholly beneath notice. Silent and contemptuous, he continued his duties with tranquil evenness. But the young reporter's spark had done its work. San Francisco was insane again, and this time as much with rage as with fear. Sober judgment became a lost art, and though no second exodus occurred, there ensued a reign of vice and recklessness, born of desperation, and suggesting parallel phenomena in medieval times of pestilence. Hatred ran riot against the man who had found the disease and was struggling to restrain it, and a light-headed public forgot his great services to knowledge in their efforts to fan the flames of resentment. They seemed, in their blindness, to hate him in person, rather than the plague which had come to their breeze-cleaned and usually healthy city. Then the young reporter, playing in the neuronic fire he had kindled, added a crowning personal touch of his own. Remembering the indignities he had suffered at the hands of the cadaverous clinic man, he prepared a masterly article on the home and environment of Dr. Clarendon, giving a special prominence to Sarama, whose very aspect he declared sufficient to scare the healthiest person into any sort of fever. He tried to make the gaunt chuckler appear equally ridiculous and terrible, succeeding best, perhaps, in the latter half of his intention, since a tide of horror always welled up whenever he thought of his brief proximity to the creature. He collected all the rumors current about the man, elaborated on the unholy depth of his reputed scholarship, and hinted darkly that it could have been no godly realm of secret and eon-weighted Africa wherein Dr. Clarendon had found him. Georgina, who followed the papers closely, felt crushed and hurt by these attacks upon her brother. But James Dalton, who called often at the house, did his best to comfort her. In this he was warm and sincere, for he wished not only to console the woman he loved, but to utter some measure of the reverence he had always felt for the starward-bound genius who had been his youth's closest comrade. He told Georgina how greatness can never be exempted from the shafts of envy, and cited the long, sad list of splendid brains crushed beneath vulgar heels. The attacks, he pointed out, formed the truest of all proofs of Alfred's solid eminence. "But they hurt just the same," she rejoined. "And all the more because I know that Al really suffers from them, no matter how indifferent he tries to be." Dalton kissed her hand in a manner not then obsolete among well-born persons. "And it hurts me 1,000 times more, knowing that it hurts you and Alf. But never mind, Georgie, we'll stand together and pull through it." Thus it came about that Georgina came more and more to rely on the strength of the steel-firm, square-jawed governor who had been her youthful swain, and more to confide in him the things she feared. The press attacks and the epidemic were not quite all. There were aspects of the household which she did not like. Sarama, cruel in equal measure to man and beast, filled her with the most unnameable repulsion, and she could not but feel that he meant some vague, indefinable harm to Alfred. She did not like the Tibetans either, and thought it very peculiar that Sarama was able to talk with them. Alfred would not tell her who or what Sarama was, but had once explained rather haltingly that he was a much older man than would be commonly thought credible, and that he had mastered secrets and been through experiences calculated to make him a colleague of phenomenal value for any scientist seeking nature's hidden mysteries. Urged by her uneasiness, Dalton became a still more frequent visitor at the Clarendon home, though he saw that his presence was deeply resented by Sarama. The bony clinic man formed the habit of glaring peculiarly from those spectral sockets when admitting him, and would often, after closing the gate when he left, chuckle monotonously in a manner that made his flesh creep. Meanwhile, Dr. Clarendon seemed oblivious of everything save his work at San Quentin, whither he went each day in his launch, alone save for Sarama, who managed the wheel while the doctor read or collated his notes. Dalton welcomed these regular absences, for they gave him constant opportunities to renew his suit for Georgina's hand. When he would overstay and meet Alfred, however, the latter's greeting was always friendly despite his habitual reserve. In time, the engagement of James and Georgina grew to be a definite thing, and the two awaited only a favorable chance to speak to Alfred. The governor, whole-souled in everything and firm in his protective loyalty, spared no pains in spreading propaganda on his old friend's behalf. Press and officialdom both felt his influence, and he even succeeded in interesting scientists in the East, many of whom came to California to study the plague and investigate the anti-fever bacillus, which Clarendon was so rapidly isolating and perfecting. These doctors and biologists, however, did not obtain the information they wished, so that several of them left with a very unfortunate impression. Not a few prepared articles hostile to Clarendon, accusing him of an unscientific and fame-seeking attitude, and intimating that he concealed his methods through a highly unprofessional desire for ultimate personal profit. Others, fortunately, were more liberal in their judgments, and wrote enthusiastically of Clarendon and his work. They had seen the patients, and could appreciate how marvelously he held the dread disease in leash. His secrecy regarding the antitoxin they deemed quite justifiable, since its public diffusion in unperfected form could not but do more harm than good. Clarendon himself, whom many of their number had met before, impressed them more profoundly than ever, and they did not hesitate to compare him with Jenner, Lister, Koch, Pasteur, Metchnikoff, and the rest of those whose whole lives have served pathology and humanity. Dalton was careful to save for Alfred all the magazines that spoke well of him, often bringing them in person as an excuse to see Georgina. They did not, however, produce much effect, save a contemptuous smile, and Clarendon would generally throw them to Sarama, whose deep, disturbing chuckle upon reading formed a close parallel to the doctor's own ironic amusement. One Monday evening early in February, Dalton called with the definite intention of asking Clarendon for his sister's hand. Georgina herself admitted him to the grounds, and as they walked toward the house, he stopped to pat the great dog which rushed up and laid friendly forepaws on his breast. It was Dick, Georgina's cherished saint. Bernard and Dalton was glad to feel that he had the affection of a creature which meant so much to her. Dick was excited and glad, and turned the governor nearly half about with his vigorous pressure, as he gave a soft, quick bark and sprang off through the trees toward the clinic. He did not vanish, though, but presently stopped and looked back, softly barking again, as if he wished Dalton to follow. Georgina, fond of obeying her huge pet's playful whims, motioned to James to see what he wanted, and they both walked slowly after him as he trotted relievedly to the rear of the yard, where the top of the clinic building stood silhouetted against the stars above the great brick wall. The outline of lights within showed around the edges of the dark window curtains, so they knew that Alfred and Sarama were at work. Suddenly from the interior came a thin, subdued sound, like a cry of a child, a plaintive call of "Mama! Mama!" at which Dick barked, while James and Georgina started perceptibly. Then Georgina smiled, remembering the parrots that Clarendon always kept for experimental uses, and patted Dick on the head, either to forgive him for having fooled her and Dalton, or to console him for having been fooled himself. As they turned slowly toward the house, Dalton mentioned his resolve to speak to Alfred that evening about their engagement, and Georgina supplied no objection. She knew that her brother would not relish the loss of a faithful manager and companion, but believed his affection would place no barrier in the way of her happiness. Later that evening, Clarendon came into the house with a springy step and aspect less grim than usual. Dalton, seeing a good omen in this easy buoyancy, took heart as the doctor wrung his hand with a jovial, "Ah, Jimmy, how's politics this year?" He glanced at Georgina, and she quietly excused herself, while the two men settled down to a chat on general subjects. Little by little, amidst many reminders of their old youthful days, Dalton worked toward his point, till at last he came out plainly with the crucial query. "Alf, I want to marry Georgina. Have we your blessing?" Keenly watching his old friend, Dalton saw a shadow steal over his face. The dark eyes flashed for a moment, then veiled themselves as wonted placidity returned. "So science or selfishness was at work after all. You're asking an impossibility, James. Georgina isn't the aimless butterfly she was years ago. She has a place in the service of truth and mankind now, and that place is here. She's decided to devote her life to my work, to the household that makes my work possible, and there's no room for desertion or personal caprice." Dalton waited to see if he had finished. The same old fanaticism, humanity versus the individual, and the doctor was going to let it spoil his sister's life. Then he tried to answer. "But look here, Alf. Do you mean to say that Georgina, in particular, is so necessary to your work that you must make a slave and martyr of her? Use your sense of proportion, man. If it were a question of Sarama or somebody in the utter thick of your experiments, it might be different. But after all, Georgina is only a housekeeper to you in the last analysis. She has promised to be my wife and says that she loves me. Have you the right to cut her off from the life that belongs to her? Have you the right?" "That'll do, James." Clarendon's face was set and white. "Whether or not I have the right to govern my own family is no business of an outsider." "Outsider? You can say that to a man who—" Dalton almost choked as the steely voice of the doctor interrupted him again. "An outsider to my family, and from now on an outsider to my home. Dalton, your presumption goes just a little too far. Good evening, Governor." And Clarendon strode from the room without extending his hand. Dalton hesitated for a moment, almost at a loss what to do, when presently Georgina entered. Her face showed that she had spoken with her brother, and Dalton took both her hands impetuously. "Well, Georgie, what do you say? I'm afraid it's a choice between Alf and me. You know how I feel. You know how I felt before, when it was your father I was up against. What's your answer this time?" He paused as she responded slowly. "James, dear, do you believe that I love you?" He nodded and pressed her hands expectantly. "Then, if you love me, you'll wait a while. Don't think of Al's rudeness. He's to be pitied. I can't tell you the whole thing now, but you know how worried I am. What with the strain of his work, the criticisms, and the staring and cackling of that horrible creature Sarama, I'm afraid he'll break down. He shows the strain more than anyone outside the family could tell. I can see it, for I've watched him all my life. He's changing, slowly bending under his burdens, and he puts on his extra brusqueness to hide it. You can see what I mean, can't you, dear?" She paused, and Dalton nodded again, pressing one of her hands to his breast. Then she concluded, "So promise me, dear, to be patient. I must stand by him. I must. Dalton did not speak for a while, but his head inclined in what was almost a bow of reverence. There was more of Christ in this devoted woman than he had thought any human being possessed. And in the face of such love and loyalty, he could do no urging. Words of sadness and parting were brief, and James, whose blue eyes were misty, scarcely saw the gaunt clinic man as the gate to the street was at last opened to him. But when it slammed to behind him, he heard that blood-curdling chuckle he had come to recognize so well, and knew that Sarama was there. Sarama, whom Georgina had called her brother's evil genius. Walking away with a firm step, Dalton resolved to be watchful, and to act at the first sign of trouble. This concludes the first part of 3 total of The Last Test by Adolphe Danziger and H.P. Lovecraft, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.